Okay, I think we are
Yeah.
now live on YouTube too. So, woohoo!
Okay.
Families can watch at home via YouTube now as well. So, all of our programs, Zoom programs, that is, will be on our YouTube page, and I can see Mary laughing right now.
All right.
Well, you're probably hearing my voice from. I'm gonna mute that because that would not be fun to hear. Me reading 2 times. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so we can get started with the program. And then Mary, and then you guys can hear from Mary because that's what you're here for. So welcome to the Traverse Area District Library presentation of Once Upon a Time in the Stars with Mary Stewart Adams. This program is part of our 2020 Summer Reading Club. And if you'd like more information or if you'd like to sign up, you can go to our summer reading page at tadl.org/summer-reading. So if you have some questions for Mary, just go ahead and type them in the chat box for us. Other comments are welcome, but please limit the silly stuff just so everybody can enjoy the stories and performance. If you have any technical questions, go ahead and type those in the Q&A box. I'll do my best to answer everything, but as you see, we're just getting started using Zoom for our programming. So I hope you have some patience as you already have. Also, if you miss any of the stories in the program or you want to watch them again, we will have a recording of this video posted on our summer reading page, tadl.org/summer-reading. Just scroll to the bottom. You can find summer videos there. And you can also, since we are filming our direct live presenting on our YouTube page, you can go there and view the video as well. And that's TADL, not just books. All right, well, let's have me stop sharing my screen so you can hear some stories. And let's give Mary a nice welcome.
All right. Thank you so much, Andy. And thank you everybody for being here. It's a glorious day in Northern Michigan. So I'm happy to have this few moment to put some story inside this day. And I actually have 3 stories that I'd like to share that belong to what's happening in the season. And after the stories, then I will show how these weave into what's happening right now. But for now, let's just get started. The first tale I would like to tell comes from the Pueblo tradition in Southwest North America. And it's called The Arrow to the Sun. And for this tale, I have my golden yellow cape on because this is the brilliant color of the sun as it's highest in the sky during the solstice time. Now, long ago, the Lord of the Sun sent the spark of life to the earth. It was a mighty arrow that traveled quickly down the pathways of the sun's rays until it came into the home of a maiden living in a pueblo. And this is how the young boy came to the earth. And he grew up happy and well with his mother, but all of the other children, especially the boys in the community, they never wanted to play with him because they would tease him and say, well, we don't know who your father is. And he was sad, and this made his mother sad too, until eventually he felt that he was strong enough and old enough that he could go out into the world on his own and find his father. And so he took farewell of his mother, and he made his way a long way until he came to the corn planter. And he said to the corn planter, can you lead me to my father? Well, the corn planter had no answer for him, and he just continued planting his corn. And so the young boy traveled farther on until he came to the pot maker. And he said to the pot maker, can you lead me to my father? Well, the pot maker had no answer for him. She just continued making her pots. So then he traveled on yet again until he came to the arrow maker. And he said to the arrow maker, "Can you lead me to my father?" Now the arrow maker was wise, and he could see that this boy was from the sun. So he fashioned a mighty arrow, and placing the boy on the arrow, he put it in his bow, and he shot it toward the sun. And the boy traveled far, far, far until he arrived at the kingdom of the Lord of the Sun. And he said, "Father, it is I am here, your son." And the Lord of the Sun looked at him and said, "Perhaps you are my son, perhaps you are not. First, you must be tested in the 4 chambers of ceremony. If you can endure these tests, then we shall see if you are in fact my son." And these 4 chambers are the Kiva of the bees, there's the Kiva of the lions, the Kiva of the serpents, and the Kiva of lightning. If you can endure these trials, then we will know. Well, the boy said, "Surely, Father, I can endure these trials." And he traveled until he came to the Kiva of the bees, and he passed by with great success. Then he came to the Kiva of the lions, and again he was successful in passing through the ceremonial rite of the Kiva of the lions. And then he came to the Kiva of the serpents, and once again, though he may have struggled, he made it through the Kiva of the serpents, and then he passed into the Kiva of the lightnings. And when he emerged from the Kiva of the lightning, he was completely transformed. And he stood there before the Lord of the Sun, and the Lord of the Sun said, "Indeed, you are my son. And because you have successfully passed through the 4 Kivas of ceremony, now I can fashion another arrow and send you back to the earth to take with you the wisdom of the sun." And so placing the boy on an arrow once again, he shot him back along the sun's beams, back to the earth. And when the boy returned to the earth, all of the people there were so delighted to welcome him back, and they celebrated their delight with him in the dance of life. And that's the story of the arrow to the sun that comes from the Pueblo tradition, which I shared just this few days before summer solstice when the sun comes to its highest hour. And I had for that my golden yellow cape, which I will now take off because now it is time for the story of the queen bee. Now, the story of the queen bee comes to us from the storytelling tradition of the Brothers Grimm. The Brothers Grimms were librarians that lived and worked in Germany, and they protected the tales that were told throughout their geographic region because they wanted to protect their culture. So storytelling wasn't just for children, although it's a wonderful thing for children, it's also meant for adults. And the Brothers Grimm were very good about gathering all of the tales that existed in their time in their region of the world. And so to this day, we can thank them for the great work that librarians do to keep storytelling going. All right, so this is the tale of the queen bee. Now, once upon a time, there were 3 brothers, 2 elder brothers and their younger brother, whom they considered a simpleton. And the 2 older brothers, they wanted to go out into the world and seek adventure. And their younger brother, Simpleton, said, "Please let me go with you." And they said, "Well, you can come with us, but you've never really amounted much to anything. So just make sure that you stay out of the way." And so he agreed because he always wanted to be with his brothers. And so they traveled far and wide out into the world. And at a certain moment in their journey at the edge of a forest, they came to a very active ant hill. And the older brothers just wanted to stamp on it to see what the ants would do, go scurrying about. But the younger brother stood in front of the ant hill and said, "No, no, don't bother the creatures. I won't let you harm them." Well, they scoffed at him and they left the anthill alone and they traveled along until they came to a pond. And there in the pond, they saw a beautiful, beautiful duck swimming, and they took their guns out and they wanted to shoot the duck so they could have it for dinner. But the youngest brother stood in front of them and said, "No, no, I won't let you harm the creature. You must leave him in peace." And so they traveled on again yet further. And then they came to a hollowed out tree. There was a very large beehive there that was dripping with honey. And the older brothers wanted to snuff out the bees so that they could take all the honey. And the younger brother stood in front of the tree and said, "No, I won't let you snuff out the bees. I won't let you harm these creatures." Well, so at this time they were starting to get tired, and they wandered a little further on through the forest until they saw a castle. And they approached the castle, and it looked as though there were no one there. The doors were wide open. There were no lights on, but they entered nonetheless. And finally, they made their way up a mighty staircase, and before them they saw 3 doors. And looking through the first peephole of the first door, they could see nothing. And through the second peephole, they saw nothing. But through the third door, the mightiest one that was at the center, they looked through, and they saw a gray old man sitting there. And they knocked on the door, and he didn't respond. And they knocked again, and he still didn't respond. But then they knocked a third time, and the gray old man stood up. He opened the door, and he welcomed them in. He set before them a magnificent meal so that they were very well fed, and he showed each one where they would be able to spend the night in a well-appointed bedroom. But before that, he showed them a mighty stone tablet, which had 3 tasks on it that they must complete if they were able to successfully leave this castle. Well, they went to bed confident that they would be able to complete these tasks. And then in the morning, one by one, they decided to take their turn. So the oldest brother decided that he would go first. And the first task that he had to do was to gather the 1,000 pearls from the princess's necklace, which had broken when she was playing out in the yard. And these 1,000 pearls must all be gathered by the sundown, or the brother would be turned to stone. Well, you can imagine that gathering 1,000 pearls would take a long, long time. And when he went out into the yard, he saw pearls scattered everywhere, and some in places that were very difficult to get to. And by the time the sun set, he had only gathered 200 of the 1,000 pearls. And unfortunately for him, he was turned to stone. Well, the very next day, the second brother said, "Well, perhaps I can do better where my brother failed." And he was led out into the garden, and there he started to gather up the pearls, and he gathered a few more than his older brother had gathered. But by the time the sun was setting, he had only gathered 400 of the pearls, and he too was turned to stone. Then the youngest brother, the simpleton, on the very next morning, he was led out into the same garden, and he was beside himself because he knew that his brothers had both failed at this, and there they were, turned to stone. And he fretted about how could he gather 1,000 pearls when they who were older than him had been able to do so much more. And just then he heard a teeny tiny little voice speaking to him. And looking down at the ground, he said that he saw that it was the king of the ants. And the ant king said, "Oh, youngest brother, you protected us, and now we can help you. And my troops are here to help gather up all the pearls." In a very short time, all 1,000 pearls were nicely stacked. And when the youngest brother was able to show the gray old man, he said, "Very well, you have succeeded in this task. Now let's see if you can do the second one." And the gray old man led the youngest brother to a pond that was near the castle. And this was a very, very deep pond. And he said, "The princesses lost the key to their room in this pond. You must find this key before the sun sets, or you know the fate. You will be turned to stone." So the youngest brother stood there at the edge of the pool, and he was very worried that this was a much more difficult task, and he didn't know how to swim, and it was a large pond, and the key could be anywhere. But just then, a beautiful duck appeared before him, swimming up, and said, "Youngest brother, you protected us, and now I can help you." And the duck dived down below the water and was gone for quite a while, but pretty soon the duck emerged, holding the key in its beak. And so the youngest brother was able to give the key to the gray old man, and the man shook his head, and he said, "There now remains but one task for you. You must take this key and unlock the bedroom where the 3 princesses are sleeping. However, you must take the hand of only the youngest and the loveliest princess, and then the spell will be broken, and the enchantment on this castle and your brothers will be released. But here is the trick. The three princesses look exactly alike, and you must be able to discern between them which is the youngest. So the youngest brother took the key, and he was able to unlock the door and entered the bedroom. And there, in fact, were three beautiful princesses, all of them exactly alike. It was difficult to tell the one from the other. But here was the difference. Each one of them had eaten something sweet before they went to sleep, and each one of them had had a different sweet. The first sister had had a sugar cube, and the second sister had had some maple syrup. The third sister had eaten some honey. And just as the youngest brother stood there agonizing over trying to discern which one was the youngest sister, the queen of the bees whom he had helped flew into the room and settled on the lips of the youngest sister who had eaten the honey. And the young boy took her by the hand, and the moment she opened her eyes, the spell was broken from the castle. His older brothers rather, were freed from their statuary as stones, and they all lived happily ever after. And that is the story of the Queen Bee from the Brothers Grimm, and that went with my pink cape. So I will take that one off now. And if you have a blue cape, you can join me now in our third and final story that, and as I shared afterward, I'll explain how each one of these stories connects to what's happening in the sky in this season. All right, so settle into my blue cape. And this final story is the story of the girlfish. And the girlfish is one of my favorite fairy tales, and it comes from Andrew Lang's Orange Fairy Book. I'm sure you can find it at the library. And it's a wonderful, wonderful tale. Andrew Lang, also like the Brothers Grimm, gathered fairy tales from not only his own region in the world, but from around the world. And all told, I think there are 14 color fairy books. So this particular tale comes from the Orange Fairy Book. So each one of the fairy books has a different color. Even though it's the Orange Fairy Book, I chose my blue cape, and you'll pick up the moment in the story that made me decide to wear the blue cape. So listen in for it. All right, so here is the tale of the girlfish. Once upon a time, there was a husband and a wife, and they had an only daughter. And the husband was a fisherman, and the wife took care of the home. And though they loved their daughter dearly, she was never really helpful around the house or with the fishing. But the mother spoiled her and took care of her well anyway. But then one day, the mother was particularly tired as she was doing her work in the kitchen. And even the daughter could tell that her mother was tired. And finally, she said to her mother, "Mother, is there anything I can do to help you?" And the mother was so astonished that her daughter, who had never been helpful before, would be offering her assistance that she didn't know what to say. And she said, "Well, actually, my dear, you could be helping me in the kitchen, but I know how to do my work here. Why don't you go and ask your father? He's mending his nets. He might be able to use your help." So the daughter went to her father and said, "Mother sent me out here to see if I might be able to help you." Well, the father was just as shocked as the mother had been, because the daughter had never offered to be of any assistance. And so he said, "Well, I'm mending my nets, and perhaps you can help me. And once you've mended one of the nets, you can toss it into the water and see if you might be lucky at fishing." And so she mended the net, and then she tossed it into the water, and sure enough, she caught a fish. It was a beautiful little fish. And just as she pulled it out of the water, the little fish said to her, "Oh, please, please don't eat me. I can grant your greatest wish if you just put me back in the water." Well, the girl thought, it's kind of unusual to catch a fish that can talk, and it's a beautiful little fish, kind of a pretty thing, and it would be a shame to eat it, but I really want fish for dinner. So she took the fish home, and she said, "Mother, I would like this fish for dinner, and you must cook it for me." And she said, "Even though it's kind of a shame because it's a pretty little fish and it begged me not to eat it." And the mother said, "But daughter, don't you think that if the fish could grant your wish, that might be better than eating it?" And the daughter said, "It's fish I'm wanting, and it's fish I'll be having, and you'll cook that fish for me." So the mother did her daughter's bidding, and she cooked the fish. and she placed it on her daughter's plate. And the moment the daughter took a bite of the fish, the most unusual thing began to happen. Her head started to flatten out, and the eyes moved to either side of her head, and her arms turned into fins, and her whole body flattened out, and she flopped onto the windowsill, and pretty soon out of the window and into the lake. Actually, it was more than a lake. It was a great and mighty sea. And she found herself in the sea, kind of gulping the water, because she didn't realize that now she was a fish. And she really didn't know how to be a fish. I mean, a fish knows how to breathe under the water and swim. And she was kind of startled at this quick transformation when all of a sudden another school of fish swam up to her and said, "Well, we can see that you ate the fish, didn't you?" And she said, "Yes, I did." And she said, "And you're not," they said, "You're not really a fish, are you?" And she said, "No, I'm not. I was once, very recently, a girl." And they said, "So were we. And we too have been turned into fish. But come with us. We'll take you to the palace of our queen. It's much more beautiful than any palace anywhere you've ever seen on the earth." And they swam very quickly away, not remembering that she was only just a fish, and it was hard for her to learn how to use her fins and her tail. But soon enough, she was able to catch up with them. And after a long while of swimming through the sea, she saw the most beautiful, brilliant light streaming through the waters, and very colorful corals and rocks and things she had never seen on the earth. And soon this mighty palace loomed up before them. And the girl fish said, "Where are we?" And the other fish said, "This is the palace of our queen." And they swam into the palace and came before a mighty throne. And there on the throne sat a beautiful woman. Well, actually, she's what we would call a mermaid, because only the top half of her body was a woman. The bottom of her body was a long, beautiful fish's tail. And even though she was a lovely woman living in a beautiful palace, she was sitting very, very sadly on her throne. And the girl fish was introduced to her as the newest member of the school of fish there. And the queen looked at her and said, "Like you, I too was once a human being. And I was happily married to the king. And I was gifted a beautiful crown on the day of my wedding. And I was told that as long as I wore this crown, that all would be safe and happy and well in the kingdom. And I lived for a long while very happily with my husband, the king. And we had a beautiful child, a son, who was growing strong and wonderful, until one day, as I was walking through the palace garden, an ogre reached over the palace wall and snatched the crown from my head and placed a curse upon me, that I would have to be here in this form, half woman, half fish, the way you see me, until someone can restore my crown to me. Could you be that someone?" Well, the girl fish was brand new at being a fish, but she knew that she wanted to be a human being again. And so she said, "I can try. I would very much like to help you and to help all of us." And so the queen gave her the secret spell that would allow her to be a shape changer. And so she told her the way, and the girl fish swam to the edge of the water, and chanting the spell, she was able to transform herself into the form of a deer. And as a deer, she cantered through the forest on her way to the palace. But lo and behold, the prince was hunting in the wood that day, and he hunted the deer, and she ran and ran to try to hide from him, because she had such an important mission and she really didn't want to get captured by the prince. But soon she stumbled on a rock, and out of breath, she fell in place, and the prince came upon her, and aiming his arrow at her, she looked up at him with her very kind and pleading eyes, and she spoke, "Please don't shoot me, prince. I have a very important mission that matters to more than just myself." Well, the prince was so taken aback that the deer spoke to him, and also at the deep loveliness in her eyes, that he thought to himself, surely this can't just be a deer. And while he was thinking about this, she was able to get up and prance away. So she made her way to the base of the palace, and she saw the the window very high up in the tower where the ogre was sleeping. She could hear him snoring, and she transformed herself into a monkey to climb up the tree that was out the window of the palace. And then she swung over onto the ledge of the window, and then she transformed herself into a beautiful bird. And she flew over to the ogre's pillow, and she kind of pecked him lightly on the ear so that he would wake up very gruffly, as he did. And he said, "What is it that you want, waking me like this?" And the parrot said, "Oh, ogre, you are such a wise and generous being. Could you not please give me the crown of the queen?" Well, the ogre thought to himself, I would give you this crown if you would bring me something more lovely. You must bring me the stones, the blue stones from the Arch of St. Martin, and I can weave them together into a necklace. And if you bring me those stones for that necklace, then I will give you this crown. So the parrot flew out the window and then immediately transformed herself by chanting the spell into an eagle so she could fly faster and further. And she got to the place where the bridge of St. Martin was, and using her beak, she pecked out some of the fine blue stones, and she carried them back to the ogre, and she laid them before him. And he said, "Well, these are lovely, but they're not as lovely as I thought they would be," even though the girl fish, now still as a bird, knew as well as he that he was only lying, because they were beautiful blue stones. But then the ogre said, "No, I'm thinking that if I'm going to give you my crown, then you must bring me a crown that is much more beautiful. You must bring me a crown of stars." Well, the girl fish, who was still in her parrot form now, flew out the window and flew down to the ground and turned into a human girl and walked along through the wood and thought, "How can I find a crown of stars?" And then she came upon a beautiful pool of water in the woods. And by this time, night had fallen, and it was very dark everywhere in the woods, but the sky was shining so brilliantly. The stars there were sending out a light such that she had never seen. And when she looked into the pool of water, there she saw the stars reflecting. And she took a pouch that she had with her, and she gathered up this star water, and taking it back to the palace, she wove it into a crown that she gave to the ogre. And the ogre said, "Oh, indeed, this crown of stars is much more lovely. You may have this other crown." And so the girl fish, who of course, remember, she had to become a parrot to fly up into the window. As a parrot, she gathered up the crown. She flew down out of the window, back down to the earth, and so that she could go swiftly using the spell, she transformed herself into the deer. She galloped to the edge of the sea, transforming herself into the fish again and carrying the crown in her mouth. She swam back to the palace of the queen. Now, you can imagine that all this time that she had been shape-shifting from deer to parrot to eagle and gathering the stones and gathering the water and conversing with the ogre and escaping the prince, that this had kind of taken a long time. And the other fish that were waiting in the palace of their mermaid queen were getting sad and thinking that there would be no way that the girl could complete her task. And in fact, she should have been back by now. And they thought that all hope was lost when there in a distance, they started to notice a radiance coming toward them. And it got stronger and stronger and stronger until they realized it was the girl fish carrying the crown of their queen. And once she placed the crown on the queen, the spell was broken. They were all transformed back into the human beings that they were, and they found themselves on the seashore. Well, the queen made her way back to the palace, and there was just a wonderful and happy reunion, except for one thing. Her son had taken ill, and it had been so long since she had seen him. He was just a babe when she was transformed into a mermaid. And she was taken into the room where he lay very ill. And she said, "What is it, my son? I've come back to you, and maybe now I can bring news that will help you." And the prince said, "Well, it's so unusual, mother, that I even am hesitant to tell you what it is that ails me so. And her mother said, oh, my son, so many strange and wonderful things have happened. Don't be afraid to share with me. And so the prince explained to her that he had been out hunting and he came upon a deer, unlike any deer that he had ever seen before. And just as he had aimed at the deer with his bow and his arrow, the deer spoke to him and asked him to please not slay her. And he said, Mother, the look in her eyes led me to believe that this was no ordinary deer. And in fact, I suspect that it wasn't a deer at all. And the thought of not being able to uncover this mystery, excuse me, is what has made me so ill as you find me now. Well, the queen had a big and beautiful smile on her face, and she said, oh, my son, I think that I can solve this mystery for you. And calling to her court, excuse me, the young maiden that had once been the girl fish that had done her the mighty deed of transforming into the deer and getting her crown for her, was brought to the palace. And when she looked into the eyes of the prince, he recognized that in fact this had been the deer that he had seen. And they fell in love and were married and lived happily ever after. And that's the story of the girl fish from Andrew Lang's Orange Fairy Book. All right, so these three tales I chose because of the way they're connected to what's happening in the sky in this season. And if you don't have a lovely crown, I encourage you to make a crown, because this is a wonderful time of year to wear a crown, because in the northern hemisphere where we live, when the sun comes to the place where it's highest above the celestial equator, we call this the summer solstice. And it's as though the sun is crowning the day with greatest light. And we have more daytime than we do have nighttime. And in the evening then, once the sun does finally set, it's almost 10 o'clock by the time the sun is going down. Then when the stars come out, we start to see that the constellation of the starry crown, Corona Borealis, will be highest in the sky. So this is really poetic, that we have the sun crowning the day, and then we have the crown adorning the night at the highest place. So I'm going to share with you a couple of images that my sister created for a calendar we did that was called Fairy Tale Moons. And this calendar was meant to support storytelling with things that were happening month by month through each season. And so for the month of June, we had the story in one of the calendars from the Pueblo tradition, which I told you first, which is called Arrow to the Sun. And here in this moment, you see the young boy addressing the Lord of the Sun, and he's being told that in order to prove whether or not you are my son, you must pass through the 4 chambers of ceremony. So it's the chamber of bees, and the bees, I imagine, belong to the beehive cluster, which is in the region of the stars of Cancer, the constellation that the sun is approaching at this time of year. So we can't see it in the sky right now, but it's as though the sun is moving through that chamber of the bees. And then the second Kiva that the boy has to pass through is the Kiva of Lions. And I imagine the Kiva of Lions to be like the constellation of Leo. And in most ancient traditions, the sun has the rulership over the region of Leo stars. And at this time of year, here in June, as the sun is approaching the stars of Cancer, just beyond it, it starts to move through the region of the constellation Leo. So I imagine that this is the Kiva that the sun must pass through in order for him to determine that the Lord of the Sun is in fact his father. And then the third Kiva, I hope you remember, was the Kiva of Serpents. Now the Kiva of Serpents can be likened to there's a couple of constellations that I think we could liken this to. There's the constellation of Draco, the dragon, which is a serpentine being that's always overhead every night. So we can see this in the summer, we can see it in the fall, we even see it in the winter. So it may not be that constellation that is connected to the serpent in our story. It might instead be the constellation of the Hydra. Now the Hydra is a water serpent, and it's a very long constellation. It snakes up over the horizon and is there all summer long, and it only sets in the fall. And so I imagine in this tale that when the boy has to pass through the Kiva of the bees, that's connected to Cancer, the Kiva of the lions, that's connected to Leo, and the Kiva of serpents, that's connected to the constellation of the Hydra. And then the lightnings belong to the weather that happens in this time of year. And in some Native American traditions, the full moon in July is called the thunder moon, because this is when we have this thundering weather with the lightning and the thunder. So it's all this summer season when the sun is highest up, when I imagine that the boy, as an arrow, is able to make his way to the sun and ask if the Lord of the Sun is in fact his father. And then the second tale, the queen bee from the Brothers Grimm, again, this is leaning on the relationship to the constellation Cancer, the crab, which has this collection of stars at the center of it, which it wasn't until the 1600s when the astronomer Galileo used his telescope that he was able to see that this smudge of light at the center of the constellation was actually a cluster of stars. And so this starry cluster is called the beehive cluster. So I liked our story of the queen bee, which is the queen bee actually unlocks the third and final mystery for the simpleton. So he's able to determine which is the youngest daughter asleep there in her bed. So you can see the three of them there asleep, and the queen bee is about to settle on the mouth of the youngest daughter to break the spell. All right, and then our third story, the girlfish. This is an image that shows the moment that the girlfish comes upon the pool of water in the forest, and she sees the starlight of the starry crown reflecting in the pool of water. Now, I really particularly like this because I do my work with the stars here in northern Michigan. I'm on the shores of Lake Michigan, and if you know Michigan, then of course you know that it's all about the water. And there are many, many wonderful nights when you can see not only the sunlight in the daytime, but then the moonlight at night, and oftentimes the light of the brighter planets and of the stars in the water. And I like to think that that's the time when we can have a kind of a direct experience of the stars. If you go swimming by the light of the stars, then you can imagine that, like the girlfish, you're gathering up this star water to fashion a crown. But also just so that you can find your way to the crown in the night sky, because you can't see the constellation Cancer right now, because that's the region that the sun is moving toward in the summer months. And so it's kind of swallowed up by the light of the sun. Leo, you can still see right now, but it's starting to fade. The Hydra is a long constellation. You can find a map. I'm not going to show you that one, but I am going to show you the starry crown, because this one comes highest up at night. And it's pretty easy to find if you know how to identify the Big Dipper. So in this image that I'm showing you, the Big Dipper is on the right-hand side of the picture. And the Big Dipper has 4 stars that make up its cup, or the ladle. And then it has 3 stars that make a handle. And the 3 stars seem to have an arc. So it's not just a straight handle, it's kind of curved. But if you follow that arc, the natural arc of the Big Dipper's handle, it arcs to the bright star Arcturus. Now, Arcturus is so bright that it's actually a star that appears in the sky before you can see the Big Dipper. But if you're not sure that you're looking at Arcturus, you just wait for it to get dark enough, and then you'll see the Big Dipper and you can follow this arc. It's just a natural arc and you'll see it. And this will be high up, kind of looking toward the west, but high up in the sky. And Arcturus is one of the brightest first stars that you'll see high in the west when the sun sets at this time of year. So you follow the arc of the Big Dipper's handle to Arcturus. And then you go up 1 star. You can see that Arcturus belongs to the constellation Boötes, and Boötes is kind of shaped like a kite. But from Arcturus, you go up 1 star, and then you skip over to the left 1 star, and you come to this collection of, it looks like about 5 stars that make a soft U, or even a C. And that's the constellation Corona Borealis, which is the starry crown. And you can look for that right almost highest up, directly overhead at this time of year. So Arcturus will be a little bit to the west. You'll see the Big Dipper arcing toward it. And then from Arcturus, you go up 1 star and left 1 star. And there's the starry crown adorning the night. All right, so it wouldn't be summer if we didn't celebrate the golden daisies that are blooming right now. So I just wanted to share that picture with you on this final slide, and to say thank you for joining us today for storytelling for Once Upon a Time in the Stars. There are an endless number of stories that are connected to the stars, but actually I should say, rather than being connected, the stars are hidden in the stories. And so it's kind of a summertime quest to go find as many stars as you can in the night sky, but also in the fairy tales that come from every tradition around the world. All right, so thank you very much. And may we all know a happily ever after. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Andy, and then I'll come back. All right.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mary. We wanted to open it up if anybody had questions they'd like to ask Mary at this point. I can unmute anyone who is on oh, Camille has a question there.
Okay.
You have spoken of next spring equinox as the time of fruition for seeds we plant during this solstice. Does that go for every year or more so for this year?
That's a very good question. And so I'll explain it a little bit further. The human being, it takes a human being 9 months from conception to birth. And so when you look at the cycle of the year, you can think about it that way, that every year has a particular mood and quality. You could even say that every year is its own being. And one of the challenges that we have as human beings is to try to unlock the mystery, just like the simpleton in the story of the queen bee has to unlock the door and unlock the mystery of which one is the youngest daughter. And it's the virtue that he's exhibiting along the way that helps him to unlock this mystery. And so the same would be true of us. The good deeds we do for one another help us to understand the mystery of the year. And so at summer solstice, when it's as though the sun is coming to its highest place in the sky and the crown is highest up at night, this is, you could say, the beginning of we're conceiving something new for the new year that will come, because we're as though offering the blossoms, like the earth has blossomed up toward the sun. And in the flowers, what you see is that like the bees will come to fructify the flowers so that they can bear fruit. And then out of that fruit, we will gather the seed that we will plant for the next season. So at this time of year, it's like something happens. It's like that conception, and I'm reaching up because it's like reaching way up into the sky and into the starry world. And there we receive this beautiful gift of sunlight and of starlight that we then carry back. It's kind of like breathing this in back toward the earth. And then the seeds that we plant that winter overnight beneath the earth begin to sprout up in the spring. And so I imagine that this is a process that happens every year, not just this year, but then if you wanted to qualify it year by year, you start to look at some of the other things that are happening that might give a clue about what the coming year is going to be about. So we're approaching summer solstice right now. Today is the 18th of June. The summer solstice will occur in our time zone, in the Eastern time zone, at, I believe, 5:43 on Saturday, June 20th. And then just a few hours later, when the sun has gone below the horizon for us, the moon is going to come new, but it will eclipse the sun. Now, we won't see it because hopefully we'll all be sleeping because it will be happening at 2 o'clock in the morning. Nonetheless, the sun is at its highest place in the sky relative to the earth, and the moon is going to eclipse it. So that lends itself to being a particular mood. We're trying to conceive the new year, and then there is the moon kind of standing in the place of the sun. It doesn't quite diminish the sunlight. It allows for some other mystery to unfold. Then we have the planet Mercury, the god of communication, just today has come to a place where he stops in his tracks, and then he moves retrograde. So that's happening. That's happening today and will last until about the 12th of July. And then we also have in a few days the planet Venus, which has moved into the morning sky. We'll probably just start to see Venus tomorrow morning with the moon. That will be lovely if you want to get up early. Venus is about to stop her retrograde motion and go direct. So all of these things happening at the same time, where Mercury stops and turns and the sun comes to its solstice and stops, and then Venus is stopping and turning, all of that lends itself to the mood of what's coming. And I guess I would just imagine it that the celestial gesture is saying, okay, human being, don't be reactive. Take time, stop, pause, breathe, step back, consider your action before you go forward. Before you speak, which is connected to Mercury, god of communication. Before you, with Venus retrograde, you could say that Venus is kind of withholding her feeling life, or the love. Venus is connected to love and beauty, and now Venus is about to go direct and say, just flood the situation with love. And the sun is also at its highest place. And even though the moon is eclipsing it, an eclipsed sun can be like an opportunity to do something when otherwise we might not have that opportunity. So hope that's not too vague, but that's the way I would understand the mood of this time of year in 2020 as we're getting ready to conceive the seeds for 2021. Patience, breathing, grace, and many, many stories that end with a happily ever after that are augmented by capes and crowns. I'll just show you that this is just a piece of watercolor paper. I watercolored one half of the paper and then cut out the different flowers and the leaves that I made. And then I just used some tape to tape the edges on there. So I encourage you to make a crown for going out to tell your storytelling beneath the stars. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes, and the theme of patience is so so necessary right now as we're all kind of hurrying back to be in society again, and
Yeah.
you know that we need to take some breaths, and you know.
I mean, we see it not only in the gesture of the planets right now. Solstice means sun standing still. So we're coming to this moment where the sun stands still. Mercury is standing still before it turns retrograde. This technically is called station, like it's walking along and then it stops and then it goes back. Venus is coming to its station. So it's moving backward, it stops, and now it's going forward. You can also think about it in your breathing. You don't have to change your breathing, but if you just pay attention to your breathing, we breathe in and then we breathe out. And at each breath, we pause. So you pause at the end of the out breath before you breathe back in, and then pause and breathe back out. And that pause is like this solstice moment. And so if we could really concentrate on that pausing, we do need that kind of patience and pause. And then you see it over and over again in the tales, in the arrow to the sun. It's not just an immediate, it's not just a reaction. He's got to travel quite a bit. First he meets the corn planter, then he makes the pot maker, then he meets the arrow maker, and then he gets to the Lord of the Sun, and then he has to go through these 4 kivas, and there's time that has to be spent to really demonstrate that he can endure the challenge with patience and not give up. And the right thing will come to pass. And then in the story of the queen bee, I mean, he has to help the creatures, first the ants, and then the duck, and then the bees, and then his brothers have to be turned to stone one at a time, and then he's got to go through the 3 challenges. So there's always that. And then, of course, in the girlfish, it was even right in the story that they're all like, oh, she's never going to make it. She's never going to get back. So having patience is really important in this season, and I would say at this point in history, the grace that comes from being patient. Yeah. So thank you, Camille, for the question, and thank you, Andy, for the clarification. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, it doesn't look like we have more questions. I just want to share my screen briefly just to remind folks of some upcoming programs at the library. We have fantastic fairy tales on our Facebook Live page tomorrow, Friday, the 19th at 11 a.m. Mr. Matt is going to do the magic of steam. He's one of our staff members, and that'll also be on TADL's Facebook Live page. And then next Thursday, June 25th at 11 a.m., we will have Acting Up Theater presenting Imagine Your King. So all of these events, you can find out more information on TADL's events page. That's tadl.org/events. And there are also listings on our Facebook page. So we'd like to thank everyone for attending this morning's program, and look to the stars and think of all these great stories that represent this time of year. And we'd like to also thank Mary again for pushing through the Zoom, program.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Yeah,
you're so welcome.
Okay.
You're so welcome. So
bye.
Thanks again.
Wonderful day. Lots of good storytelling, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Hmm. So next time. She's definitely. Okay. Well, let's give it a moment.